Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we have felt Jehovah's loving care as we've received helpful direction just at the right time. Please listen and watch as those who work in the Coordinators Committee office recount how events unfolded with the pandemic and how Jehovah has guided matters throughout this time.
In January of 2020, we started seeing news reports about a disease outbreak in Wuhan, China. Now, at the time, it seemed localized and was not of global concern. But a short time later, the numbers were going up as the virus began to spread. Borders were closing and airports were shutting down.
On January 22nd, the Coordinators Committee received their first letter from a branch about the coronavirus. The letter was from the Korea branch. Soon after that, we wrote to all branches in and around Asia and included guidelines on what to do if they had an outbreak in their territory.
We had dealt with local epidemics before, but nothing like this on a worldwide scale. It was clear that the virus was going to affect almost every aspect of our theocratic operations. And during those first few months of 2020, the organization would be faced with a huge amount of decisions.
You have to realize that this was catching us right in the middle of our activities. Our schedule for the whole year had already been planned. We had shepherding visits to branches, regional conventions, even special conventions. And now we had Gilead graduation and memorial coming up right in front of us. What were we going to do?
Oh, that's easy. What you were going to do, Mark Sanderson, is put a doomsday spin on everything and use the pandemic as an opportunity to terrify Jehovah's Witnesses into thinking the end is near.
What we're experiencing right now in this global pandemic, I was telling the branch class yesterday, it doesn't bother me. We've been waiting for this. We knew things like this were going to happen. Christ Jesus has prepared us. Where's the shock?
So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
I should mention that we've just been watching a video segment on the organization's handling of the coronavirus pandemic that was shown at the annual meeting, the 2021 annual meeting, which was held on October 2nd. The organization seems really, really proud of the way they have dealt with the pandemic. As I've repeatedly said on this channel, to a degree, they're right to be pleased with themselves, because I could certainly imagine the organization having a worse response. I mean, when you look at fundamentalist Christianity and fundamentalist movements around the world and the way they have responded to the pandemic, you know, engaging in denialism, COVID denialism, the anti-masker, anti-vax movement, Jehovah's Witnesses, by comparison, have actually been quite responsible in observing social distancing, in being very pro-vaccine. So the organization's response to the pandemic has largely been very good, and I'm grateful for that, because I genuinely worry about the plight of Jehovah's Witnesses, obviously more from the perspective of them being duped and exploited and misled and in some cases killed by being made to refuse blood, or their children being put in danger through the organization's child safeguarding policies. I fear for the plight of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I care about them. I live with Jehovah's Witnesses in my house. My wife's parents are Jehovah's Witnesses, and we live in the same building. And I was fearful at the start of the pandemic that the organization would be irresponsible. The memorial was coming up, and I feared that they would view this as an opportunity to show how fanatical they were an opportunity to show observance of this important commemoration. Oh, who cares about the pandemic? God's going to protect us. We should meet anyway. That could very easily have been their attitude. They didn't have that attitude, and I'm glad. However, do they deserve a medal for doing the right thing? And more to the point, is their handling of the pandemic proof that Jehovah is guiding the organization? That's the argument they are making in this whole segment. We're going to see anecdote after anecdote pointing the audience in that direction, steering the audience towards that conclusion. And I'm sorry, it's just not going to be convincing, at least not for me.
The graduation of the 148th class of Gilead was in 2 weeks. Should we have guests come? Should there be a live audience? There was not much time to make these decisions. However, after prayer and discussion, the entire governing body decided not to have a live audience for the Gilead graduation that weekend. That was unheard of.
The next thing we needed to figure out was whether to lock down headquarters at Bethel. I clearly remember it was a Friday night, March 13th. We were getting reports of COVID cases in the congregations around Bethel. And we also knew that the Bethelites would be going out to their congregation and other activities over the weekend. If we were going to do something, we needed to do it quickly.
We called each member of the governing body and explained the situation. And all were unanimous that we should lock down Bethel immediately.
So within the hour, a message went to the entire headquarters and United States Bethel family to stay in. And if you were out, to return to Bethel immediately.
Sometime later, we learned that there were some COVID cases at Patterson. If we had moved ahead, potentially, we could have spread COVID through the whole Bethel family. We really felt Jehovah's protective hand.
The same weekend as the Gilead graduation, the Memorial Invitation campaign was scheduled to begin. And so branches were asking, is it safe to go door to door and to distribute invitations? What if we can't meet in our kingdom halls?
As the virus had spread in many countries, it became evident that we needed to suspend the public ministry. This was a very serious decision. But when we prayerfully analyzed the situation, we realized we would not be showing respect for the sanctity of life or love of neighbor if we continued house to house. Our preaching work shifted to letter writing and telephone witnessing, and what a huge witness has been given in this way.
It was amazing to me personally when I saw how quickly the brothers could adapt to using Zoom, phone witnessing, letter writing, and instead of it being a huge setback for the work, it was almost as though the work even moved ahead.
Again, we're being asked to believe that Jehovah's Witnesses were something special during the pandemic, a global pandemic that affected everyone. We were all impacted by it. All countries, all organizations, all companies, all religions, all impacted by this pandemic. And the audience at the annual meeting, and by extension, any Jehovah's Witnesses who end up watching this talk, which will presumably be millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, are all being expected to believe that the speed with which the organization responded to COVID-19, to the pandemic, is proof of Jehovah's hand. Well, the pandemic was declared on March 11th. And on March 11th, the NBA suspended its season. The football leagues in England reverted to 0 spectator games. There's actually a Wikipedia page that gives you a timeline. I'll drop it in the description so you can see for yourself. You can see a timeline of all the action that was taken around the world by various governments and organizations in response to the pandemic. And the more you look at this, the more you realize there was really nothing special about the governing body's response. If anything, they were behind the curve. Or if they were ahead of the curve, if their response is proof of God's blessing, then what do we say about the NBA? What do we say about the soccer leagues in England? Google, I'm looking at the list now. On March 11th, Google asked staff in the United States and Canada to work from home to reduce the spread of COVID. And what were they just bragging about earlier? That on March 13th, Bethel went into lockdown. Google goes into lockdown on March 11th. Bethel goes into lockdown on March 13th. But apparently Jehovah's hand was with Bethel. I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense. Again, it's one thing to rewrite history when you're talking about the murky past, when you're talking about events decades or even centuries ago that people either physically cannot remember or have difficulty remembering. But how dare they insult our intelligence by rewriting history as recent as the outbreak of the coronavirus, which we can all remember, and which is so well documented on Wikipedia and elsewhere, that when Tony Morris is making stupid claims like the following...
Sometime later, we learned that there were some COVID cases at Patterson. If we had moved ahead, potentially, we could have spread COVID through the whole Bethel family. We really felt Jehovah's protective hand.
We can look at those words coming out of Tony Morris's mouth and say, you fool, you bloated, arrogant charlatan. You are using a pandemic. You are using something that has killed millions, including over 20,000 of your own followers, of your own fellow believers, brothers and sisters. You're using it as currency. You're using it as some means of impressing people with your authority. Jehovah's hand swooped to the rescue to protect you, to protect Bethelites who might have picked up COVID from someone at Patterson. That's what Jehovah's hand was busy doing on March 13th. 2 days behind the curve, 2 days behind the NBA, behind Google, behind a whole other bunch of countries and organizations that took immediate action. And Tony Morris has the arrogance and stupidity, quite frankly, to stand in front of millions of people and say, we're special, we deserve special protection. Never mind the tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses who've died since the outbreak of the pandemic. What mattered, what really mattered, and where Jehovah's hand really needed to come to the rescue is in stopping us from getting coronavirus. As long as we survived, that was the main thing.